Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And if you're outside of Santa Fe, you can listen by streaming it live from ksfr.org. I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today I'm going to be talking with Miranda Viscolli. She's the co-president of New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence. And we'll be discussing the recent epidemic of mass shootings and how, while mass shootings in America grab the headlines, the vast majority of gun deaths are not from mass shootings, but from suicide, domestic violence, and homicide. And each form of gun violence can be reduced with somewhat different solutions. We will also talk about the political reality in New Mexico and the United States and the constraints those realities impose on the imagination and courage of legislators in DC and in states. We'll get to Miranda in just a moment, but first a few short announcements. I want to acknowledge that this show is being conducted on stolen Tewa land, and I want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We could certainly learn from them, and we had better do so, and soon. Last week, I spoke with Gary Coffin, the Vice President of Indivisible Not Hill, who is filing an amicus brief with the state Supreme Court. The brief opposes Avangrid and PNM's appeal of the PRC's denial of their proposed merger. They actually are appealing it to the Supreme Court. If their appeal is upheld and the merger goes through, it would effectively result in the colonization of New Mexico, as Gary laid out very clearly in our interview. Now that the primary is over, Retake will begin focusing on 2023 legislative session with a Zoominar series focusing on key bills we will be supporting and initiatives we oppose. We begin the series with our next huddle, July 13th from 6 to 7:30, for a discussion focused on gun violence prevention with today's radio guest, Miranda Viscolli. During the Zoom, we will initiate discussion of what might be possible in 2023 by way of meaningful gun violence legislation and how you can help. Join our Zoom huddle to find out more about specific legislation we can support and some powerful actions we are planning to create pressure on the legislature to act. You can get info on our huddles by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, and clicking on the actions and events in the menu bar. Look for Zoominars on public power, public banking, health security, paid legislature, and more. They'll be scheduled throughout the summer. For right now, the only one posted is the one on gun violence prevention. Finally, I wanted to remind you that if you're driving around and miss any of today's show, you can watch the full YouTube recording of this show and any prior interview by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on the Retake on the Radio button on the right side of the homepage. You'll find YouTube recordings of all of our previous shows. Okay, let's get started with Miranda. Let's dive in. Welcome, Miranda.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Sure. Did you finish the Wordle?
No.
Oh, got to do it before 6. Well, welcome, Miranda. I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So how about we start with you telling us a bit about yourself and how you got involved with gun violence prevention advocacy.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I'm co-president of New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence. I got involved 10 years ago. We started New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence. We were a group of concerned New Mexicans that felt that the trajectory of gun violence in our country and state was having a devastating impact. And so we just rolled up our sleeves and started getting to work.
So you said you're co-president of New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence. I experienced your work most directly just before and during legislative sessions. But can you tell us a bit about what you and NMPGV do throughout the year as well as during the legislative session?
Yeah, sure. In fact, the legislation is probably only about a quarter or an eighth of what we do. We created a multi-pronged approach to the issue because it's a multifaceted problem that needs a multi-pronged approach. So we started creating and doing programs, the majority with our youth, since they are the ones that are often most adversely affected by gun violence in New Mexico. We created a program called Murals to End Gun Violence, where we work with youth. They design a mural from beginning to end on gun violence prevention. We hire Warren Montoya from San Ana Pueblo to facilitate the projects. And we've just completed our 12th, our 11th mural, and we're slated to do 3 more murals next year in school, two in schools and one in a community garden. These are messages of hope and peace and nonviolence that we try to get into our communities and our schools. In addition to that, we also took on a program called the Student Pledge Against Gun Violence. We didn't create this program. This was a national program already being done. And what we saw was that it gave youth an opportunity to create events in their schools on the issue of gun violence prevention. There was no other group that was helping and facilitating a space. And what we did see was that there was a 54% reduction when we brought this into our schools in New Mexico, in northern.
54% reduction in what?
I'm sorry, of bringing weapons to school,
Oh,
in Santa Fe and northern New Mexico during the time we were doing the pledge. We're excited to pick the pledge back up in our Santa Fe schools again and in northern New Mexico and hopefully some more in Albuquerque. Another one of our projects is Guns to Gardens. So we do gun buybacks throughout the state. We just did a gun buyback last Saturday in Albuquerque, and we took in 240 firearms, including a machine gun, 5 sawed-off shotguns, several AR-15s, and 2 AK-47s. The majority of people that participate in our gun buybacks are doing so for safety reasons. Our next gun buyback will be July 23rd in Santa Fe at Fiesta Auto. They are sponsoring this event. And the gun buybacks give people an opportunity to get rid of those unwanted guns, because those are the guns we're most worried about. Those are the ones that nobody's watching and get stolen, end up in unsafe hands. It's called Guns to Gardens because then we dismantle the guns on site, and then we forge the guns into gardening tools with a group called Raw Tools in Colorado. And then in addition to that, obviously we do a lot on gun safety. We are on a lot of panels and committees to help communities rein in the gun violence. And then we do legislation.
okay. Well, that's a lot of stuff. No wonder you're so hard to get a hold of. Busy woman. I just wrote about the 20 mass shootings that have occurred throughout the US in 2022. But in doing that research, I found that while horrific and headline grabbing, the majority of gun deaths in America do not occur in mass shootings. And of the 20 mass shootings this year, only one occurred at a school. So despite the NRA's effort to paint our problems as school safety issue, the real problem is much more pervasive. Can you outline how most gun deaths occur in the United States?
Yes, so the majority of gun deaths in the United States are suicide. In New Mexico, 63% of our gun deaths are suicide. We're a little bit different when it comes to children. We're half and half homicide, half suicide, and we're losing close to 3 children and teens every single month in New Mexico to gun violence. So suicide prevention is a very important aspect of the work that has to be done. The NRA during mass shootings wants to stigmatize people who are suffering from mental illness and try to make sure that everybody in the school is armed, which we saw that good guy with a gun myth was debunked in Uvalde when there were 19 good guys with guns that didn't have the courage to go into that classroom.
Yeah. Well, the other popular framing of the issue following Uvalde is that we have a mental health problem, and funding for the mental health services could prevent gun violence without punishing responsible gun owners. In other words, we just got to prevent mentally ill people from getting guns. Can you talk about the role mental health plays in gun violence and some of the misinformation about mental illness and gun violence?
I'm sure, yeah. So the majority of people who are suffering from mental illness are not going to commit gun violence on other people. They most likely will die by suicide. But what we do after a mass shooting is we start, the NRA and the gun lobby want to point to something other than the guns. So they sit there and stigmatize people suffering from mental illness. That's not the problem. Other countries have people who suffer from mental illness and they don't have this problem. So I think we have to stop looking at mental illness as being the problem and making sure that people realize it's the guns that are the problem and the mass amount of guns that we have in our country.
Right. So if the majority of gun deaths are from suicide, what policy or policies might actually reduce gun suicide? And would that really reduce suicides or simply cause those in despair to look to other means of killing themselves? Is there research on this?
Yeah, so usually the problem with death by a suicide with a firearm is that it's a very effective way to die, and most people from the studies that have shown that have uh, attempted suicide with other forms usually live and usually don't ever attempt to die by suicide again. The problem is the guns make it very lethal.
Okay, well, we need to take a brief break here to remind our listeners that KSFR is more important than ever, offering timely news and alerts and a wide range of programming to keep you informed and sane in these ever so challenging times. In an era replete with misinformation, at KSFR you get the straight scoop, great music, and informative discussions on timely issues. So for those of you who can afford it, please consider making a contribution and think of it as your ticket for admission to a wealth of welcome programming. Just go to ksfr.org and click on the donate button. Let's get back to our discussion with Miranda Viscolli.
I do think we need to mention, because we were talking about suicide, that anybody who does feel like they are suffering from suicidal ideation, to please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255.
Thank you for that. That's a timely piece of information. My somewhat random review of research points to but one indisputable cause of gun violence: the number of guns in a community and the ease with which people can access them. Is this what the research says, that there's a direct correlation between the number of guns and the amount of gun violence?
There definitely is. So if you look at our states with the least amount of gun violence and strong the states that don't have as many guns and have strict gun laws, there's much less gun violence. So if you look at a state like New Mexico, we have some of the highest gun ownership in the country. We do now have gun violence prevention laws. Now it's going to take some years to start to finally see those numbers going down. But for many, many decades, we were awash in guns, which we still are, and also had an F with Gifford Law Center because we had no gun violence prevention laws on the books.
So hopefully we're going to move up from F with some of our legislation in the last few years.
We already have. I think we're at a C.
All right, well, let's get to an A. If you look at gun violence internationally, most countries have roughly the same levels of mental illness, domestic violence, and drug addiction, but the US far exceeds the number of gun deaths. To what do you attribute that difference?
Again, it's the lack of gun violence prevention laws and the fact that we have so many guns. I mean, it's the guns. if toasters were killing this many people, we'd fix the toaster, right? I mean, that's the analogy I always use. It's the guns. It's not, it's not anything else. A knife. One person with a knife could not have done the carnage that happened at the Tops Market or Uvalde.
Right, right. Well, the NRA and the GOP want to do anything but reduce the sale of guns and want to focus on mental health and school safety. Wouldn't fixing our badly flawed universal background checks process be more effective? Aren't there risk factors that are much more strongly correlating with gun violence than mental health status? And what are those risk factors? And couldn't a more rigorous background check process track those risk factors and prevent those at high risk of committing gun violence from getting guns?
Yeah, I mean, background checks have to be passed. The Washington package. I'm glad Senator Heinrich is working towards it. It is something, but it's a baby step. We need background checks. We do need to close the loophole so that it's done. The domestic violence firearm relinquishment law that they want to have. They call it the boyfriend loophole. I don't like to call it that. I like to call it, the partner loophole. In addition to that, we should have a 10-day hold on the sale of handguns. We should have much more, a much stricter background check system anyway, in terms of who can own a firearm and who.
What's wrong with the background check system the way it is now?
One, there's the Charleston loophole. So if that's where, remember actually the anniversary of that, I think was just yesterday or the day before yesterday, and that's where the young man would not have passed the background check, but it was taking too long. And so I think it's within 72 hours. If they still haven't gotten results of a background check, that person can buy a gun. Well, it has, or 24 hours. Well, it has to be, it doesn't matter how long the background check takes. If the system's bogged down because so many people are buying guns, they have to wait their turn. And so I think closing that Charleston loophole would be a great way to go. I think we also need to register gun owners. I think we should know who owns guns in this country. We should license them. We should regulate guns for safety. We don't even do that in this country. We
Mhm.
regulate every single item in this country for safety except for firearms.
That's staggering and sort of revealing in many ways. The evidence seems clear that if you reduce access to guns and simply stop selling them, you reduce gun deaths. That certainly seems to have been the case in New Zealand. What happened there? And what has been the impact in New Zealand?
They immediately banned assault weapons, and there hasn't been a mass shooting since. And the NRA and the gun lobby and the radical, very radical gun folks want to say that assault weapons don't exist. Well, they do exist. And why they need to be banned is that they're war tools designed to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. A trigger alert, because this is uh, may sound a little graphic. When you're shot with an assault weapon, that bullet tumbles through your body and pulverizes your organs. That's why survival is very your chances of survival are pretty low. If you actually get shot by a shotgun or a semi-automatic handgun, depending on where you're hit, you actually have a good chance of living if you can get to help. But with an assault weapon, it's a done deal.
That's what happened in Uvalde. They couldn't even recognize the kids,
No, there's no
identify
reason
the
for us
kids.
to have these in our communities, and we
So
don't
what
need
is
them for
so
hunting.
different about America that so completely prevents passing meaningful gun violence prevention legislation? There seems to be, the polls show support for gun violence prevention legislation. And yet every year something comes up and everybody's all hot and bothered. We're going to get something done now, and then nothing happens.
Yeah,
Why?
no, I mean, sadly, the NRA and the corporate gun lobby have run Washington for decades and decades and decades. And it's not even just the money, it's they scare them. You saw it happen in Colorado where the Democrat got primaried out because he supported a piece of gun violence prevention legislation. They scare legislators into um, making sure that they don't do anything. And then you also have this bogus, interpretation of the Second Amendment. You have a Supreme Court that, you know, sides all the time with the NRA, and it's shame on them. I mean, our country is devastated by gun violence, and we still do nothing.
Yeah, wasn't the vote in New Zealand something like 118 to 1? I mean,
Yeah,
and they did it like in a week after the tourists were mowed down.
exactly. Yes, and so that is a perfect example of a country that took action.
Okay. So New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence has led efforts to pass gun violence prevention in the legislature in prior sessions. Can you run down some of your successes, and maybe we'll then talk a little bit about 2023?
Sure. So the first piece of legislation we worked on passing was actually closing the gun show loophole. And we had Governor Martinez at the time as a governor, and we thought, well, that's some low hanging fruit. And of course, she didn't. We actually got it with bipartisan support through the House and Senate. It was Senator Ivy Soto who filibustered it on the Senate floor, again, a Democrat, and it died. I don't know if she would have signed it or not, but it was disappointing to see bipartisan support on a piece of gun violence prevention legislation. So after that, we started working on a universal background check law, and we finally did get that passed. Our governor Michelle Lujan Grisham has been very strong on gun violence prevention. She's the first governor in the history of New Mexico to actually pass a gun violence prevention laws. In addition to that, we worked for 6 years and finally passed getting guns out of the hands of domestic violence offenders under protective protection orders. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is some law enforcement agencies refusing to make sure that the guns are being removed from the domestic violence offender. APD has yet to take in one firearm. It's unconscionable. There are other police departments and sheriff's departments that are similar, and then there are those police departments and sheriff's departments that actually are using the law as the great tool that it is. In addition to that, we passed an extremist protection law. Some people call it a red flag law. We don't like to do that, as it stigmatizes people suffering from mental illness. And so, what this does is, let's say John down the street is drinking a lot, getting pretty violent, but there's no crime that's happened. There's no protection order from his family, or maybe there's no protection order yet. And they can petition to law enforcement. Anybody can. The neighbor can, the police can, the DA can, a school admin person can. Anybody can petition to law enforcement and say, this is what I'm seeing and this is why I'm concerned. And then law enforcement goes to the judge and there's due process. And if the judge goes, yeah, this seems like a pretty dangerous situation, John probably shouldn't have his gun, and the gun is taken away for up to a year. What we saw, and again, a trigger, because this does talk about sexual assault and violence. In 3 or 4 weeks ago in Albuquerque at the Colorado, I think it was the Coronado Park, near in some parking lot. There had been previously a 16-year-old girl said to her mother that her mother's boyfriend had been sexually abusing her for 10 years. She was 16. The mother did the right thing. The mother immediately called the police. She filed for an emergency protection order and a protection order, and obviously kicked him out. Now, under the domestic violence law, we could only get that to take hold during the protection order, not during an emergency protection order. So that's another reason why we passed the extremist protection order law, because during that very dangerous time, while usually the person who identifies as a woman is waiting for that protection order to take place so the person can't have a gun, the ERPO law can come into play. And police can petition to a judge to say, this person is very dangerous. We're waiting on the protection order. Let's file an extremist protection order. So this man who had been abusing the 16-year-old girl, the mother told the police, and he has a handgun, right? He ends up shooting and killing in a car the 16-year-old girl, her boyfriend, and himself. Had the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department done their job and filed for an extremist protection order, those two young people, those two teenagers wouldn't be dead. And so it's just another example as to why law enforcement has to uphold the laws that we have passed.
So what's on the agenda for 2023?
So for 2023, we're doing two things. We're working on getting an Office of Gun Violence Prevention, so we can get reoccurring funding for prevention. That's very important in a state that has so much gun violence. And then in addition to that, we're working with Senator O'Neill to raise the age of somebody who can own a semi-automatic rifle or an assault rifle. So right now, how the law stands, when you turn 18, you can go buy an assault weapon or a semi-automatic rifle. You can't buy a semi-automatic handgun. So we want to make sure that those other two types of firearms are also included to at least be up to 21.
And the reason we're not going after just a ban on assault weapons?
I don't know if it would happen. They might be. I think Representative Day Hockman V. Hill is. My thought about that is, obviously I would love to see that. I don't know if it's possible in New Mexico. And two, when you look at our gun deaths, and what kind of guns are being used, it's not assault weapons. And we have so little time during a legislative session. I would like to see legislation that really goes after New Mexico's problems. That not to say I wouldn't love to see an assault weapons ban. I honestly don't know if it's possible.
Yeah, I guess you could say that, we don't have, that many deaths from assault weapons, but until this year, we didn't have that many forest fires either. It was a California problem. And so, if you're tinkering around with bad conditions, you're going to wind up with a problem sooner or later. But I understand your reasoning for targeting the high impact legislation. Have you had any conversations with students or student groups about what they may want from the legislature? And is there any planned student activism that might be coming?
Yeah, so we work with the students through the WAVE teams every year um, uh, at the legislature. We often do a die-in with them where they will lie down for 7 minutes in honor of all the children who have been shot and killed in schools. They last year they really wanted the Office of Gun Violence Prevention to get on the prevention side. I think they'd love an assault, raising the age on assault weapons and semi-automatic rifles. Um, so yeah, we'll see. There's also a child action prevention law that we're looking at, and the students in the past have really liked that legislation as well. So we'll work with them and see where they want to go.
Okay, okay. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about how they can get information about the gun violence prevention in New Mexico, your organization? Where can they
Yeah,
get it?
just go to our website at www.newmexicans2preventgunviolence.org.
Okay, and that you've got research there and summaries of legislation passed and so forth. Okay, great. So it's been great talking with you, Miranda. We actually got this done in 27 minutes. That's great. And, we'll be working with you closely on both legislation and for the Zoominar that's coming up. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
I want to close with this observation. There are generally only one or two truly transformational bills considered in any legislative session. But in 2023, there will be at least 5: public power, health security, paid legislature and legislative reform, public banking, and meaningful gun violence prevention legislation. Retake will be focusing its work on engaging, educating, and motivating our constituents to engage their legislators in some old-fashioned constituent lobbying. And to advance that work, we are scheduling a series of issue-focused Zoom webinars to be held throughout the summer. We've got lots to accomplish, so let's get this done, and it takes you to help. Stay tuned by subscribing to our blog, where you will get updated information on what issues we're working on and how to plug in. Just go to retakeourdemocracy.org and click on the get blog, subscribe to blog. It's on the right side of the page, a little button there. We'll be back next week. I'm hoping to pivot to discuss the efficacy of offering guaranteed basic income to specific populations and efforts to develop an incubator for launching GBI pilots throughout the state of New Mexico. So please tune in next week, because whoever we have on, I'm sure it will be of great value. And stay safe and healthy, and please do stay engaged and active. It's the only way we fix this mess. And again, thank you, Miranda, for being with us today.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.